Thank you so much for doing that. Okay, we're going to go ahead and get started now. My name is Brittany Gaume. I'm with the Water Advocates. Welcome to our meeting tonight. We're so grateful to have you here on our third Thursday Aguas Vida Do Your Part workshop and speaker series. We have some wonderful co-sponsors, Amigos Bravos, Interfaith Power and Light, the League of Women Voters, 350 New Mexico, and New Mexico Wild. I'd like to read a land acknowledgement. The Water Advocates' main activism areas are located on the traditional homelands of their southern Tiwa, pueblos of Cochiti, Santo Domingo, San Felipe, Santa Ana, Sandia, and Isleta, the original peoples of New Mexico, Pueblo, Navajo, and Apache, since time immemorial, have deep connections to the land and have made significant contributions to the broader community statewide. We honor the land itself and those who remain stewards of this land throughout the generations, and also acknowledge that our committed relationship to Indigenous peoples. We gratefully recognize our history.
You know, and I might add that we are here in Las Cruces in Senator Hamblen's office with the Green Chamber of Commerce. And we are in the homelands of Apache bands that are called Chiricahua, but they didn't call themselves that, and Mescalero Apache bands, and also indigenous tribes from Mexico.
We have the Piro Manso and the Tigua tribes as well, that these are their ancestral lands that we are occupying.
So we acknowledge them too.
Thank you so much for that addition. And I will turn it over to Norm now to do the introductions.
Well, thanks everybody for joining us tonight. And if you're watching us on a recording later, we are in Senator Carrie Hamblen's office in Las Cruces, New Mexico. Carrie is the CEO of the Las Cruces Green Chamber of Commerce, and she is a powerful state senator who I admire. I got the idea to ask Senator Hamblen to participate in an interview when she accepted the Luminaria Award from the Conservation Voters of New Mexico during the last legislative session. The nomination speech was brilliant, and I'm really happy to announce that the nominator is going to be part of the Water Advocates in the future.
Oh, good.
And Senator Hamblen's, Carrie's speech was really remarkable. I recorded it. I listened to some parts of it. I don't know that she remembers what she said, but I'm sure she can call some of that up again tonight. So thank you so much, Senator. I'd like to start by asking you to tell everybody, who are you and where did you come from?
Well, I appreciate that. Usually I'm on your end because for 20 years I was a journalist and operations manager at our public radio station in Las Cruces at KRWG. And so I was usually the one asking the questions. And it took me a while to get used to being on the other side of that and being able to talk articulately. But I was born in Wisconsin and my father was in the military and we moved around a lot. Because he was in the Army branch. And so we moved to Fort Huachuca. We were in Arlington Heights, outside of Chicago. We lived in Germany in a place called Ansbach, which was about 40 Ks south of Nuremberg. And then our final stop was El Paso, Texas. And so I grew up there. I wasn't born there, but I grew up there and went to high school, went to college, got an undergraduate in broadcast journalism from the University of Texas at El Paso. And then in 1992, decided to come to Las Cruces for a couple of reasons. First and foremost, it was because of a girl that I decided to move to Las Cruces. But also I was starting graduate school and received a master's in communication studies in 1995 from New Mexico State University. But at the same time, I was also an announcer at KRWG. I was hosting classical music and jazz, and then eventually got the operations manager position where I was also the morning news anchor, and I oversaw everything that went out over the radio. And Also made Las Cruces my home. I love this place, and because I was in the military so much, moving around was not something that was fun for me. So I have found that in all of my relationships, I've kind of dug my heels, and when I find a place I really like, I really hope that my partner will stay. And I'm very lucky because my wife, who is a tenured professor at the University of Texas at El Paso, loves Las Cruces too. She's originally from Chicago, so we're both desert rats and we will never leave. And we do not like the snow. Often, if you see me up in Santa Fe during the session and if it has just snowed, it is not a good idea to approach me because I get really crabby with the snow. I'm not a fan at all of the snow. I would love to move the capital down to southern New Mexico, just to let you know. But I worked in radio for 20 years and I hosted a public affairs program called Images, which was kind of designed after Terry Gross and Fresh Air, because I found that we had a lot of interesting people who were doing incredible things in our community, but they really didn't have venue to be able to share that with people. And I felt that that was my job, was to share all the amazing things that authors and nonprofit people and professors and business owners and everybody who's doing something amazing in this community. I felt that it was my job to highlight what they were doing. But then in 2012, I was asked to apply for the job of the CEO of the Las Cruces Green Chamber. It had started 2 years beforehand, and I had interviewed the CEO of the New Mexico Green Chamber, who is now with the Thornbrook Foundation, Alan Oliver, who's still a good friend. But I had interviewed him about their renewable energy conference that they were having down in Las Cruces. And poor Alan, I kept him for over an hour, and he thought it was a tough interview. I thought I was just really interested in what he was talking about and wanted to know everything I could. And come to find out, like a year later, I'm seeing Alan in a coffee shop in Albuquerque, and we're doing an informal interview. Once the board of Las Cruces Green Chamber of Commerce started and went through the hiring process, then Alan was the final yay. But I do want to point out the Las Cruces Green Chamber of Commerce started in 2010, because in Las Cruces we got an Olive Garden here, and in our local paper, before it was consumed by Gannett, our local paper had a section in the paper where you could call in and leave anonymous messages. And as a journalist, that's the worst piece of journalism, but it was the most popular piece in the paper every day. And people were calling in saying, we're finally a real city because we have an Olive Garden. And we had 3 locally owned Italian food restaurants that were saying, what about us? So the founders of the Green Chamber decided to start this organization to give local businesses a fair shake at local taxes and policies that would help them in ways that they could have their voice uplifted, because local businesses are the backbone of our community. So 2 years into it, I was asked to apply for the job, and so I left a 20-year career. I also had horrible bosses that were not good, did not like strong-voiced women, and it was time for me to leave. And it turned out actually a really good thing, because if I worked for the public radio station, I couldn't run for office because of the Hatch Act, and the university is supported by federal dollars, so I couldn't run for a partisan seat. So it worked out really well, although I did love that career. It was a great job, and I loved what I did, and often did it in my sleep. And then I joined the Green Chamber in 2012.
Well, let me just interject. During the time that I was dedicating myself to stopping the Gila diversion, KRWG was always interested in what was going on.
Yeah.
And much more so than just about any other public radio station. Well, I can't say that. Laura Paskus in Albuquerque did a super job. But anyway.
We have KRWG has a large listenership in Silver City because it's so rural, and our signal would reach to that. And so Silver City was one of, during the fundraisers, which they're having right now at the time that we're recording, I was on the air yesterday helping them raise money. Silver City always comes through, and it's a very important part of the community. And so then in 2012, I joined the Green Chamber, and immediately started working on helping local communities recognize the economic impacts of their public lands. And so first I was kind of auxiliary to the Rio Grande del Norte efforts up in Taos. And then in 2013, we became involved in the efforts to designate the Organ Mountains Desert Peaks National Monument. And we came in with the economic argument about how financially it's good for communities. Monuments make money. And so we were instrumental in that. Really, there was a group of people. I think NM Wild was part of that as well. Of this contingency of people who had been working for a long time, about 10 years, to get this monument established. But the Obama administration wanted to see where the money would go. And so we commissioned a nonpartisan economic impact study, and it showed that at the time, $7.4 million would come back into the community. It would be 88 jobs it would create, and over $500,000 in local and state taxes. Well, just as we come up on the 10-year anniversary of that, we just commissioned another report last September, and it far surpassed everything that was projected. And we were really grateful for that. And so that's where we're known both nationally and statewide for being able to make those connections with local businesses and protected public lands.
And I want to say that I think New Mexico Wild is particularly good at that. And they are also associated with the water advocates. We're trying to form partnerships so we can work on water issues together, because without water, there is no wild.
Right. No, and we work with NM Wild on some other efforts as well throughout the state, so we're very excited. So I was excited to see their logo on there. So just a summary of the Green Chamber, though. What we are known nationally for our work with the Organ Mountains Desert Peaks National Monument. I have the wonderful honor of going all over the country and sharing with communities the marketing toolkit that we developed for small businesses to teach them how to be thoughtful stewards of our public lands. And the reason why is I said, if you want to make money from it, you have to protect it. And I think that can go for a lot of things. If you want to make money from it, you got to protect it. And so been able to go to California to help them with their national monuments. Up in Maine, the Katahdin Woods and Waters National Monument. I've gone to West Virginia, I've gone to DC a number of times, gone to Las Vegas, gone to Wyoming, working with some folks in Kasner and nearby El Paso to really help make that economic argument, because that's the hard one to refute. We can talk about how it's good for the environment to protect these public lands, and it's good for the ecosystems, and it's good for the diversity, the plant and animal diversity, and those folks that are always against that have a hard time refuting the money.
Mm-hmm.
And so I don't like to diminish all of these valuable elements that make for reasons why we protect public lands, but it's the money that they have the hardest time refuting.
Well, let me just respond by saying that there is a huge economic argument for taking care of our water resources, because without water, there's nothing.
Mm-hmm.
And what's not recognized today, and that's what we're going to get into in just a moment, is that we're in dire straits.
Mm-hmm.
Dire straits.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So, why did you run for the New Mexico State Senate?
Well, to give you a little background, as an out lesbian, I've been able to do a lot of stuff for the LGBTQ community, but for many years I had to do it behind the scenes because I was a journalist and I'm not supposed to have an opinion. But those who know me, I have a horrible poker face. If you've watched me in committee, I am the worst because I don't have a good poker face and really long for the days of masks because that would hide things a great deal. But I did a lot of advocacy work for the LGBTQ community, and then when I left journalism, I was able to talk about small businesses and how important they are to local communities and nonprofits, and was able to have that opinion. But we always vote for what is our own self-interest, I think, for the most part. Like the issues that are important to you may be different than the issues that are important to me, although they overlap in some way or another. But we've all got, like, I want to make sure queer and trans kids aren't feeling like they're being attacked every single day like they do in Texas, which is 45 minutes away from here. So, that's my priority. But obviously there are other things that also come into my value system. And what I saw, first and foremost, I don't think it should be a career. 20 years is a career. I feel it should be a service, and I don't want to serve more than 2 more terms. Because my district, for the most part, is primarily Latino, and I am not that. I am somebody who hasn't had the challenges because of the color of my skin. I have had a few challenges because of my gender, not so much because of who I love, which is really interesting to me. But I was seeing First and foremost, that, and there's still my colleagues, I call them on it all the time, that have been there for many, many years. And there's some value of institutional history, but then on the other hand, it's like there are no new voices that are coming into the legislature. Unless you see like what you saw in 2020 with the election of 7 new Democratic senators. And so the reason why I decided to run for office is first and foremost because of the previous administration as president. We knew that their appointments to the Supreme Court would undo Roe v. Wade. And the person that I unseated was the pro tem. It was Mary Kay Papin. And she has done some incredible things. If it weren't for her, the former governor Susana Martinez and her whole gutting of the mental health system would have never been caught if Mary Kay hadn't gotten it. And so she's done some great things for that and for the community, especially the colonias as well. However, she was very much against removing that 1969 law that prohibited abortions and the people who provided them, criminalized those who got them and those who provided them. And for me, that wasn't reflective of the state, much less the country. And I felt that it was time for new voices. That legalizing adult use cannabis was also something that would not fly while she was pro tem. And accessing the permanent land grant fund so we could actually fund early childhood education and not impact the principal at all of the land grant fund. And so I felt those things were really holding us behind. And so there were 5 Democrats that were targeted not only by us as candidates, but by other groups that several of you may work with. And so 4 of those 5 Democrats were unseated. And we saw in the legislature in the first year, the anti-abortion law, I believe, passed, removing the anti-abortion law, I believe passed by 6 votes. I have to look back at that one. Legalizing adult use cannabis passed by 7. 6 of those were freshman senators. The End of Life Act passed with a small margin as well. The Land Grant Permanent Fund, if you look at those votes and take out 7 progressive Democratic senators, or most of us were progressive Democratic senators, but we all voted to repeal that anti-abortion law. Mm-hmm. And that's where elections matter, because they passed by 6 or 7 votes most of the time.
Well, that brings up a question that I'd like to ask you. The Water Advocates is a nonpartisan organization. We have to be because we're a nonprofit. Mm-hmm. And one of the curious things for me that I haven't figured out is it seems that values are becoming partisan.
Yeah, I don't get it. I don't get not wanting kids to kill themselves because they're being bullied at school is not a value. I don't understand why protecting the environment, including water, is not a value that everybody shares. It's ridiculous. I mean, we saw this in the Bush administration where he used gay marriage deliberately to divide the country.
Right. And, in water, there's no need for water to be a partisan issue. It should not be a partisan issue. But the values around our future, because unless we take care of our water now, and I'm going to get into the crisis we're in, unless we take care of it now, we won't have a future.
Well, and this is the problem, is that I think what we have to experience the crisis in order for us to pay attention. And, there are still, for the most part, people who aren't experiencing that crisis yet. There are farmers who are, in southern New Mexico. For those of you who may not know, southern New Mexico is a large agriculture community. We have the green chili that most people love and enjoy that comes from down here a lot. We also have pecans. Both of those are huge water suckers, especially pecans. And I wish NMSU as a land-grant university could come up with more effective, less maintenance ways, fewer, like little or smaller maintenance. Drip irrigation is hard for pecan farmers because it clogs up. But I can't understand why we can't figure out a better way to use our water.
Well, I mean, we have to get to that, and that's what planning does. Mm-hmm. We have to recognize what the facts are about water. We can't each have our own set of facts. We need to recognize a common set of facts. If we have different values, then we need to. This is what the law that the legislature passed unanimously says. Mm-hmm. It says, come together, find your shared values, expressed as the public welfare of the region. find your shared values, and then figure out what you're going to do about your water crisis.
Mm-hmm.
But we're not getting any traction on that. A lot of people know who John Fleck is. He's a great author. He now works for the Utton Center. He was the writer who wrote the State Engineer Water Policy and Infrastructure Task Force report. And it doesn't pull any punches with regard to the peril that we're in.
Mm-hmm.
But he told me long time ago, and I don't know if he still feels this way or not, that what we were trying to do in the Middle Rio Grande to avoid a compact violation probably wouldn't work because we have to have a crisis first.
Mm-hmm.
But that kind of crisis takes 12 years to resolve. And by that time, it's too late.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So that's the bind that the legislature, we need to figure out how the legislature will deal with that. But I have a few more questions about you first.
Mm-hmm.
You've just told me what you accomplished, in a sense. But
In the election, yeah.
But you didn't talk about your climate and energy work.
So I am, somebody who recognizes that I haven't had a lot of challenges in comparison to many of my neighbors and the people in this community. I was told when I went through an Emerge training, so I went through Emerge, which teaches women how to become elected officials, and you have to be a registered Democrat. Strongly recommend it. The connections and the skills that you get out of that are just golden. And there was somebody, we had a day, I'll give you a little bit of background about why I'm doing what I'm doing. We had the Campaigning on Social Justice Day, and we had the privilege walk that I hope is not being used anymore because it's very triggering for people who have experienced this. But it's where you're asked a series of questions, and you either take 2 steps forward or you take a step back. And as soon as the question started, I knew where I was going to be, and I knew where my indigenous sisters were going to be. I knew where my black sisters were going to be. I knew where the sisters that were brown, some who used a wheelchair, were going to be. And it was very emotionally exhausting. And my wife is an anthropologist, and the whole field of anthropology is based on white saviorism, of white people going into communities of color and saying, this is how you need to be. And so I'm hypersensitive about white saviorism. And one of my colleagues in my Emerge class, I said, how can I help communities without doing this? I don't want to steal their voice. And she told me, your job is to open the door and step aside. And that's what I feel I can continue to do for communities that voices aren't at the table. And so with the climate work that I've done, it's more of I'm tired of poor people getting stepped on and ignored instead, and not having, they don't have the capabilities of purchase, of hiring a lobbyist. And so a couple of the bills that I've done that I'll still continue to do is local choice energy, because I'm not a fan of investor-owned utilities. We have in Las Cruces, we have an investor-owned utility who has some of the largest electric rates for small businesses in the country. And they just closed all of their walk-in offices so that older folks who don't have computers have to pay their bills online, and they don't know how. And I'm like, that's not fair, first of all. And so that's why I brought up the local choice energy, because that will allow local municipalities to purchase the electricity from these investor-owned utilities at a lower rate and sell it lower to consumers. So it will save people money. I can tell you the investor-owned utilities didn't like it, and they told me, and I told them I didn't care. If I have somebody in my district who is trying to decide whether or not to heat their home or feed their children, what do you think I'm going to pick? And so, I'll continue to do that. We did have the Low Income Solar Act helping developers of, like, say for example, a fourplex, that they would be able to put solar on the roof, and they would be able to divide the savings in utility costs to the 4 tenants. If they had 4 tenants, it would be divided equally. I'll continue. We tried to get that ruled germane, and that wasn't ruled germane this year. But we'll bring it up again in the 60-day session should I get reelected. And wildlife stuff, for some reason I became a horse whisperer and passed some legislation that allowed horse rescues to have right of first refusal. for horses that were neglected, abused, or treated cruelly before they went to auction, so that these horse rescues would be able to spend money more on the quality of life care for these animals rather than trying to purchase them so that they wouldn't go to slaughter. And I will always co-sponsor any environmental stuff. You know, I know Senator and Pro Tem Mimi Stewart has done quite a bit. We've had the Energy Transition Act that I will, continue to support as somebody who is an environmentalist. Conservation, the Legacy Fund is something that I'm always going to be a big fan of. We had the LWCF fund that Senator Stewart led on the floor, and through my job, we did an LWCF road trip that highlighted the economic impacts of LWCF projects. The park where my wife and I got married was funded because of LWCF, and so and it's a popular park in our community. So those are some of the things. I mean, it's not like I'm diehard environmentalist. I mean, there are things that overlap quite a bit, but those are some of the things that I've done.
Well, you've done enough in the environmental side that Conservation Voters of New Mexico singled you out with their Luminaria Award. And
holy shit, yeah.
yeah, and I just wanted to latch onto that and say, hey, we've got a water problem, so I hope you'll talk to us as well.
Sure, and and this is the thing when you were talking about making it, it has to become a crisis in order for people who are not elbow deep in it to really pay attention, right? And by all means, I'm not diminishing the importance of water scarcity and drought, but it kind of has to be like a coordinated PR campaign, and that's not invalidating any of the messages that need to be said. But this is what I've learned from my stuff with the monument, is that the more information you provide people, the less they're likely to say, I didn't know. Because you can say, well, we told you that. And we put this information out there. And so I do think when we talk about getting more kind of champions for the water crisis, is really kind of this coordinated PR campaign that creates, it's not just on social media, and it's also through newsletters. But, before we even started recording, you talked about like how to get to younger people. It's all social media. And if you don't use social media, you're not going to get to them. And it's a fascinating creature because you've got to get things now under 3 minutes. Otherwise, our attention span as a society has dropped really low. So it's like in theater several years ago, they started doing 10-minute play festivals because people didn't like going along like traditional plays. They're like, I can do a 10-minute play. Same thing here. So there has to be a coordinated effort, I think, to create more awareness about really the reality of what happens when our water resources dry up. And, the thing that we always have to be careful of is you don't want to be a doomsayer, because then people are just going to automatically blow you off. But it's like, how can you meet people where they are in their lives to show them that they need to be invested in this as well? And that's, I think, the question. How can we meet them and show them how this impacts them?
One of the things that I've heard, I'm an engineer, and I've learned what I've learned about process and dealing with people really on the job. I was not trained with any of that, but my dad was a preacher, so some of it comes naturally to me. Where was I going with that?
Connecting with people and meeting them where they are.
Yeah. The issue is that unlike many of the other issues, this one is getting worse and worse and worse. And inattention today forecloses opportunities. And we're just, every year that goes by, we're cutting down what we are able to do because we are so unsustainable. And we're kind of eating our seed corn, with the way we're pumping groundwater. I mean, Portales ran out of water this year. Did you know that?
I didn't.
Eastern New Mexico University is now threatened. Its very survival, I think, is threatened because the legislator and everybody else, it's not just the legislator, it's everybody else, has allowed the Ogallala to be pumped until there's no water left. So Clovis paid attention to water data, and they've secured a supply for Cannon Air Force Base and for themselves for a few years. Portales had access to the same data and didn't pay attention, and they ran out of water this summer.
Hmm.
And what I hear from LaDonna Clayton, who's executive director of the Ogallala Land and Water Conservancy and a New Mexico water ambassador, that, well, she has a marvelous presentation called The Tale of Two Cities that compares Clovis's reaction to Portalis's. Well, yeah, communities are going to have to take responsibility, but the leadership is not there in the communities to help, like you're saying we have to do. And the legislature is not on board yet. They don't know that every year that passes, we foreclose what is
Right.
possible.
Well, and this is where, I constantly say that local elections matter. And I hate to be a broken record on it, but when we use, Senator and Floor Leader Peter Worth has said to us that he has seen more instrumental, impactful legislation passed in the last 3 years than he has his entire 18 years. And that's because the legislature changed. In the Senate, it changed. This next year, we've got people coming in from the House. Who knows what kind of beast that's going to be? But that's where your local elections really matter. You get people in those seats that will be champions for what you're seeing are major crises, and try and help them do that. I mean, I have a feeling that the folks in Clovis, the leaders in Clovis, the public leaders in Clovis, maybe didn't pay attention or take it seriously.
No, they paid attention. The Ogallala Land and Water Conservancy is a project, a program of the Curry County Commission and the city of Clovis.
Right. So I'm sorry, I meant Portales. Did
Portales,
if their community leaders and their representatives and legislators from that area didn't pay attention.
well, Senator Engel's pride and joy was Eastern New Mexico University from the things I read about him when he decided to retire.
Mm-hmm.
He always took care of Eastern New Mexico University,
Mm-hmm.
except he didn't
Yeah.
because of the water.
Yeah. Elections matter. Elections really matter.
We are not engaged in electoral politics
Mhm.
as a nonprofit.
Right.
I want to show everybody, we have news.
But if I can't interrupt, all of you who are sitting there on the camera right now, if you're invested in this, you're involved. And so, just by a show of hands, because I can see the Zoom screen, if you all would do a reaction on how many of you volunteer or get involved in your local elections, just by a show of hands. You can raise your hands. Okay. All right, they're still popping up. Good.
And I see people on that list that I know are involved that don't have their hands up.
Yeah, and
So
I think you said LaDonna Clayton. She's on there. That's nice to see your name there. Thank you. Okay, so about, from the looks of it, maybe about a third. And thank you for being involved, because sometimes it's really suffocating and overwhelming to want to even do this, because sometimes you don't see the results of what you're doing. However, what I have found is that it takes a little time to get legislation passed. And, apparently we can pass a medical malpractice bill in 3 days, but it takes, a couple years for my healthy food financing initiative, which provides low-income grants and loans to Black, Brown, and Indigenous farmers, particularly women, still hasn't passed yet, and it's a no-brainer because the return on investment is amazing. So,
but here's another side of that coin. The water state engineer Mike Hammond, when he came into office, I mean, he was the best person for that job. That nobody is better for that job than Mike.
mhm.
And I feel the same way about Hannah Risley White at the ISC. I don't think there's anybody better for those executive positions than them. But they both have agencies that require culture change within the agencies themselves. And well, I don't want to go off on that tangent, because what I want to do, we are limited in time. I want to give everybody some news, and then I want to talk about the news.
Okay.
And the news is what happened in 2023 with Rio Grande Compact deliveries, and the way those work, just to simply describe it. whatever water comes past the gauge on the bridge to Los Alamos, it's called the Otoe gauge. It's one of the first stream gauges in the United States. Right there, you have to subtract out the imported water, San Juan Chama water from Colorado, and you have to make adjustments for upstream reservoirs under complex accounting rules. But after you make those adjustments, the water that comes past Otoe is divided between the lower Rio Grande and the middle Rio Grande. The lower Rio Grande gets 57%, the middle Rio Grande gets 43. And that ratio goes up to the lower Rio Grande gets 100%, and the middle Rio Grande gets 0% of marginal amounts in high flow years, because the compact was designed to fill Elephant Butte Reservoir in big years and then let everybody get by on the flow of the river in the small years, in the drier years. But I want to show you what happened last year. So Brittany, could you put those slides up, please? So this is the first slide. It shows the history of New Mexico's compliance with the Rio Grande Compact. The compact was signed in 38. Compliance began in 1940. I don't have time to explain this, but I can tell you the story behind this graph, and most of the ups and downs are explainable. But what I want to call your attention to is the far right-hand edge of the curve, where it's going down, 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 and getting close to the red line. And what that red line says, the legend, is above this line, New Mexico is in compliance with the compact. So let's take a quick look at the far right-hand side of the line, just the far right-hand side. Brittany?
Is that the next slide? Here you go.
So there it is. That's what it looks like. And you see that little jog down at the bottom? The jogs before that little one that goes straight up at the bottom are water jogs. The little one that goes straight up at the bottom is a paper credit. It doesn't reflect wet water, liquid water. And that's what New Mexico spent. My estimate is $80 million in 12 years in litigation. And I know I was involved in preparation for litigation as ISC director when I was in office, an appointed official. And we got $10 million from the legislature when I was, and I left in 2002. We got $10 million to split between the AG and the state engineer and the ISC. And they don't count that in how much this cost. But the biggest cost has been in the opportunity cost, because when litigation like this is going on and the state engineer and the Interstate Stream Commission are spread so thin, they really get sucked into it. And if they don't pay attention to that extreme risk, they're not going to govern it. And they came out better than I ever dreamed they could. But I think it's because, in large part, because we began developing our counterclaims against Texas back in 1998. Anyway, next slide. If you strip out the paper credits, that's what the last 6 years looked like. Down, 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 up a tiny little bit, down. Last year, that last down, that's last year. That's 2023. Next slide. And we won't dwell on this, but that is the liquid water. The green bars are what the middle Rio Grande delivered in excess of its delivery obligations. The red bars are what was in arrears. The delivery were in arrears. And when you add those up annually, then you get the continuous curve that I showed at the beginning. So let's see, what's the statistic on this? New Mexico underdelivered a total of 215,600 acre feet of water that was intended for all of the water users south of Elephant Butte Dam. And so 215,000 acre feet since 2011, that's a lot of water, and 16,600 acre feet per year. Brittany, can you go back to the previous slide? So let me read the legend here. This is the last 6 years, 2018 through to 2023. The Middle Rio Grande water uses 2018-2023 included 153,200 acre feet of the lower Rio Grande's water. And that average is 25,000 acre feet per year. So the average has gone up. You know, things are getting tighter. And the reason this is happening is because water supplies are down. And guess what water uses have done?
Mm-hmm.
They're steady.
Mm-hmm.
So if you lose your income, you know, the check that's being deposited into your bank account, and you keep on spending money, guess what's going to happen? Well, that's exactly what's happening here. One more slide, Brittany. The bottom one. So this was actually an advertisement in a City of Albuquerque magazine in 1984. And there was another version of it that appeared before that. I couldn't find it, it's better, but this was the Albuquerque Living version. This slide I borrowed from the Bureau of Reclamation. They used it to close a presentation, which is why it says questions. But my work as City of Albuquerque Water Resources Manager from 1989 to 1997 proved that this is wrong. And the city then spent $500 million on a surface water treatment plant, because what we proved was that the city had imported water from Colorado, and it thought that it could pump the groundwater, which would deplete the river. The river would recharge the groundwater, and the San Juan Chama water would keep the river whole. Didn't work. That was the simple, elegant solution. Free didn't work. So $500 million. But people still hold on to this image in Albuquerque.
Was that image trying to portray that Albuquerque had a large body of water by it?
No, they were saying that is the aquifer underneath Albuquerque. That was their message.
Their graphics person is awful, because that does not look like it at all.
Well, how do you illustrate groundwater? You can't. Nobody
Well,
has
you
seen
can make it
groundwater.
look like it's underneath. My
Well,
God, it looks like it's a split. They did a shitty job on that.
The rhetoric that went with it is that Albuquerque had Lake Superior underneath it.
Oh, wow.
Literally.
Yeah, no.
And the scientists who wrote the reports that allowed that conclusion many decades later to be made knew that the aquifer wasn't the way they depicted it. They depicted it as uniform because they didn't know what was down there.
Mm.
And when I started in 1989 working on this problem, we had to prove that the aquifer wasn't the way we thought it was before we were allowed to work on a solution.
Mm-hmm.
But that took 8 years, and it got done. But my point was is that the image survives. So now with that, let me just ask you, and Brittany, we can go back. We don't need the slides. Let me just ask you, how does this grab you?
Well, you know, it as somebody who read the news for many, many years about water being released from Elephant Butte, farmers having to go to wells because they couldn't, you know, irrigation season was cut short, people who had irrigation rights, and how that would slowly decrease on how many times that they would have to water. You know, so on the periphery, certainly understanding about the importance of water. And I still remember I was reading the news the day that the desal plant opened in El Paso.
Mm-hmm.
And so, you know, it's always been something that's been kind of there, but you know, it wasn't really necessarily in my face as much until this last session, when the governor wanted to quickly force through a strategic water plan.
An unstrategic water plan.
Well, yeah, because there was no plan. And so, thanks to Conservation Committee Chair Liz Stefanik, Senator Stefanik, also Senator Shendo, and myself worked with the governor's office because they originally in this idea wanted us just to write a $500 million blank check for treating of water. And it was so vague. And we were like, no, 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 no. There needs to be a plan. We can't just write you a blank check. And no, you can't include produced water in that because that means fracking. And that's problematic. For me, it's especially problematic when I've asked the Secretary of Environment multiple times when they talk about blue hydrogen, are they devoting as much money that they want to devote to blue hydrogen to improving the soil, improving the air, increasing medical care for people in rural communities who constantly get screwed by fracking? And there was no answer. I said, you're not going to get me to support any blue hydrogen or any of the hydrogen efforts until you do that. And the same thing with produced water. And so Senator Stefanik wound up negotiating a bill. And mind you, this was 4 or 5 days before this session was going to end. And the reality is, unless it's like a super crucial, like emergency bill, it's not going to get out of there if it hasn't been heard in its first committee. And so this is where, and for those of you that are online, I always look at the session as like a season of the television show Survivor, because it's a fascinating study of human behavior and relationships, but also understanding strategy. And so, I had to explain to many of the conservation groups why this bill that Senator Stefanik had put forward for this strategic water plan, we knew it wasn't going to move. It was not going to move out of the legislature. But also the strategy on that is that we had to be really careful because we didn't want the governor to veto our capital outlay. And District 38, my district, includes a lot of rural communities that have colonias. We have 37 colonias that are part of District 38. Those are areas that were put together by unscrupulous developers. They have no running water, they have no roads, and they have no infrastructure. And so I dedicated about $3 million to improving roads in these districts because we're piecemealing these from something that we inherited back from the 40s and 50s. So there's that strategy. And I know it sounds like it's a game and it's frustrating. It's fascinating to me as somebody who has a master's in communication studies and a master's in public administration. I'm like, bring it. But it was really negotiating all of that. So the bill was originally tabled in the Conservation Committee. The governor's staff worked out an amendment that said the governor couldn't do anything with that $100 million check, not $500 million. We were like, we can't do that. There's no plan. But you couldn't do anything with the $100 million check without legislative action. We were like, okay, we're good with that. It passed out of committee. It went into finance, and Chair Munoz wrapped it into his oil and gas production, put back in produced water, and killed his own bill. It was fascinating. I was like, wow, who does that? But apparently he did. And so we knew the bill didn't go through. It wasn't going to go through. And it was this whole strategy, and it sucks because it's like people have to wait on pins and needles. But it's not a smart way. And I had asked the governor's staff, why don't we focus on local efforts to help reduce our usage of water, or at least conserve water, and so help out with the farming, help reduce the waste of water on the farming. How can we help homes get low flow shower heads and low flow toilets? I mean, whenever we're looking at an issue, I always look at it as the wheel of a bicycle. And so you've got the spoke, which is the issue, the hub, and then you've got the spokes all off it. And so we can't just look at one problem with one solution. We're looking at energy efficient homes and appliances. We're looking at xeriscaping. We're looking at farming. We're looking at these big plants like Facebook, who use all this water.
Yeah, and really don't create that many jobs.
No.
Yeah, so there were two things I wanted to talk to you about that. One is that, I think we all know that produced water is a scam.
Oh,
And maybe we all know, but it is.
yeah. And I have, by the way, I have horrible language. And so I think it's bullshit that we're talking about produced water as something that still needs to maintain. And it's really fascinating to hear folks who share those particular values go on and on and on about how it's necessary.
Right. And then that brings me to another thing. I was at that hearing in Senate Conservation, the about 50 hours before the legislature adjourned, 51 maybe. And I was listening to high government officials as purveyors of disinformation. Not miss. Disinformation. That means it's wrong and they know it and there's harm being done. What do you think about that?
Well, that's where I think, again, elections matter, but also, the challenge is making sure those who are your champions have the right talking points, but also positions of influence. And I don't like to use power because we see several people in the legislature and in the government use and abuse that power. But it's people of influence who are articulate and who can make those arguments, but also behind the scenes navigate those relationships. And that's that clever little thing. So, I mean, really looking at it like it's Survivor, you're talking about relationships and you're talking about strategy. And so how can you mold those into making sure when that disinformation comes out that you've got people who can, not only is it testifying from the public, but people on that committee can refute those comments. And that's where there's work that needs to be done prior to the session. Because I can tell you, trying to educate us during the legislative session isn't going to work. We are bombarded left and right with messages and information, and we want this and we need that. And it's all legitimate, so it's like you got to work in advance.
Right, and one of the conclusions that I drew is that water has lots of friends on the Water and Natural Resources Committee, but I think it's well known that there's a huge disconnection between the finance committees and the policy committees across the board. Across the board. So does that mean that we should be concentrating on the finance committees instead of the policy committees?
You said it, not me. Yeah, elections matter. Like, let's change that up. You know where the committees are that things get stalled and things die.
Yeah.
That's where those elections need to change.
Another aspect of the unstrategic bad water, for a few at great expense proposal, is that due to the abuse of the aquifer from agricultural pumping in the Middle Rio Grande and associated with drought and I mean, I remember when it was the early 2000s and the compact was a big deal at that point, or we were trying to make it. I was working for the state at the time, first as ISC director and then as a contractor. And pecans were being planted left and right. It's almost now that it almost seems to me like the whole Rio Grande is pecan orchards.
Yeah, I mean, it isn't. There's a lot of, there's alfalfa,
Yeah, I know.
and there's green chili, they're kind of the standard crops. When you go down further in my district, you will see a bunch of pecan orchards. But to say that it's all pecans is that's not totally accurate. Those are the two main
But
crops.
the point is that those are permanent crops, and if they don't get water for 1 year, the investment is lost. And therefore, there is no elasticity in that agricultural demand. Well, let's see. Where I was going to go with that is El Paso had no choice but to turn to desalination. And I think that's going to be the same for communities in the lower Rio Grande as well eventually. And Phil King, who is in our audience tonight, knows of potential, but the potential needs research, very basic research. And so the idea of spending $100 million on private sector infrastructure.
Oh, were you told it was private sector? We told it was public-private, but you know.
Well, what is it? I mean,
That's the
I mean,
question.
okay, and I think, like, that also brings me to another point. There's so many things to talk about. The civic sector in New Mexico, the nonprofits, and I didn't learn this until last summer. In Europe and much of the Americas, they talk about the third sector. You have the public sector, you have the private sector, and you have a very active civic sector. And the people I learned this from say the civic sector's role is to balance the other two, is to provide balance and
Okay.
connection and input. That's just an interesting observation. We need desal in the lower Rio Grande. We don't need it now. And the opportunity costs of focusing on that are huge.
Well, and that was, some of the questions and conversation that myself, Senator Stefanix, and Senator Shendo had with the governor's office was, why don't we start investing in growing our own agencies, organizations, businesses that can treat brackish water, can address our water issues, instead of holding a blank check to try and lure somebody in from outside. And also, just to keep in mind, the governor was in Dubai about a month and a half before the session started. Can't tell me there wasn't somebody already lined up for that and why she was pushing that.
Well, I didn't know this either until I started researching it, but there are many huge international companies that specialize in desalination. And they're there because of the market in the Mediterranean and rich companies. Dubai doesn't have any water. It gets all of its water from ocean desal. Well, ocean desal is a tried and true technology. You can't import it to the desert because there's no ocean. Anyway, there's these companies that, sure, $500 million, where do you want your plant?
Right, exactly. And
Right.
that's what we
Bing,
felt was
bing,
going
bang.
on. That's what we felt was going on.
Yeah, all right. So, geez, we've covered a whole bunch of stuff here. Oh, I was gonna comment on one thing. At that hearing, 51 hours before the session adjourned, I was really impressed by what Senator Harold Pope Jr. had to say. He was very eloquent, and of course he comes from military and he knows the language of unknown unknowns and known unknowns, and he was talking about known unknowns for this desal plant. All the things that everybody knows you really ought to try to figure out before you spend a bunch of money on it. And what I was thinking about when he was saying that is there are so many unknown, there are so many fundamental. No, water is a crisis, and that crisis is an unknown to most legislators. Or let me ask you, is it?
I think there are several that know that it is a crisis, and I think we've run out of time. When it comes down to climate change, I think we've run out of time. We cannot say that we have to implement things next year. We have to implement things now. And we're not doing that. And so I do think that there are people that are very much aware, the nuts and bolts and like the detail that that is really foreign to me. I need it kind of more and less, I need less
Detail.
jargon. And that's something I encourage is like, don't use all the jargon, simplify it for people who don't have a water background. Help me be able to be a better champion and be able to talk about those water issues and really like how it impacts my area. Just like with Senator Pope, how it impacts his area. That's the thing that I would encourage you to do is personalize that, because until folks see how it's going to impact them directly, it is an unknown. It's not relevant to us, exactly, blinders.
Well, no, it's bandwidth, isn't it? It's bandwidth.
Sometimes, yeah, it's because there's like, you sent me a bunch of stuff and it was really beyond my comprehension, in all honesty. Because that's what you do for a living. I can talk to you about radio and green chamber, and I can talk to you about local businesses and public lands. and advocacy, I can't talk to you about water. But I would use jargon with you that may not be familiar to you. And so I think that's where we have to be able to feel comfortable to where I can say, Norm, I don't know half the things you're saying because of the language that you're using. It's unfamiliar to me, but I get it. I get that it's a problem. So teach me how I can talk in my voice about how important this is and use examples on how it's going to impact my community. Because I've got pecan farmers. I've got two of the largest pecan farmers families in my district. And I constantly have conversations with at least one of them about like, how can we reduce your water use? We have a land grant university that has the capabilities to do that research.
Yeah, I want to share a story with you. I went to college here, and I joined a fraternity, and we would hold parties in a groundwater only pecan orchard that was mature when I was in school here in the 1960s. It was mature, belonged to the Solopex. And so they had developed groundwater only pecans outside of the irrigated area of the district. I don't know how long. I mean, ages. And well, all of the development of water down here happened because development wasn't controlled across the state line in Texas, is my theory. And so the state engineer said it's free for all. And that free for all, well, it's coming to an end now. And the end is not going to be, it's not going to be as bad as many people think, but it's not going to be pleasant.
Right.
And unfortunately, it's just the beginning of a down trend.
Yeah. Well, you know, and I think about our state departments, and I see Renee Romo on here. Sorry, Renee, that you are here from Senator Ben Ray Lujan's office. Is that, you know, we have these opportunities to work with both federal legislators, and I know Renee and Melanie Goodman and Ashley Byer with Senator Heinrich's office and Representative Gabe Vasquez. You know, I do feel that it's that the public leaders and their staff are very approachable. So we can have these conversations. So like Renee can give me a call and say, hey, the senator is working on this, and we think that there might be something complementary to do at the state. And so I feel really grateful for that. And I think it's something that is very unique to New Mexico, is that your public legislators, your leaders are accessible and you can talk to them. I don't know how many times I can go to the grocery store and somebody will be talking to me about it. And I think that's great. Because we're also an unpaid legislature. So that's really the only time you're going to be able to get me, because I don't have staff, just to put that plug in there. But just in case you didn't know that we were the only volunteer legislature in the country, so you get a part-time legislator.
We knew that.
Problems all the way around. Yeah, I figured that this crowd would know that. But that we also have, you know, we have some folks who are really good in these state offices. And then we have some folks that aren't. And there's the concern about, you know, being appointed by the governor. You know, I do have issues with like Board of Regents being appointed by the governor. You know, years ago, there was Javier Gonzalez, the late Javier Gonzalez. Loved Javier as a person. He was a dear friend. But he was on the NMSU Board of Regents, and he didn't have a background in higher education. And I think the people who serve on Board of Regents need to be elected by their communities so that they can do what's best. And NMSU is experiencing this. We've got some people who are local, some people who aren't. And the university is stomping out fires left and right. And so, you know, I think I have issues with government appointment. However, I know through the Rules Committee that is led by Senator Katie Duhigg and vice chaired by Senator Leo Jaramillo that there's quite a bit that goes on in debate for those folks that are appointed to those cabinet positions. So I'm kind of on the fence about the appointment by the governor, but I also feel like that the legislature is like a board of directors. Our job is to make sure that we support people who are doing things in their community that we don't have the capacity to do, or that we do with our state departments. Our job is to support them and help them do their job.
Can I ask you a question? The legislature doesn't have any water experts.
Not that I know, but Senator Cervantes might say that he is.
Oh, he would. And he is. And he has his own perspective. And he talks about the settlement that was before the Supreme Court yesterday in terms that really are not true. about what that does to the Middle Rio Grande? I mean, it doesn't affect the Middle Rio Grande at all, except that we still have to deliver, and we're not. Okay, so that hadn't changed, and nothing else is going to change. I feel that the Lower Rio Grande's turned well, the Lower Rio Grande didn't do it, the feds did it. They turned the Rio Grande into a canal. They call that canalization. In the Middle Rio Grande, it's channelization. Here, it's a canal. I think it's time to go to our audience for questions now.
I'm fine with that.
All right, so Brittany, what do you have for us?
So we had one question from the chat from Bill Hainberg. Bill, do you want to unmute and ask your question?
Yeah, sure I can. And hi, Norm. It's been a while since we've run into each other.
Hi, Bill.
So I worked a lot on New Mexico water issues in the 90s and was away from New Mexico for about 25 years and back now. And I was gently, I'll put it, disappointed to see how much effort was put into this species strategic water plan and how little effort was put into supporting sound water science and planning and policy. And you've been talking about a lot during the past hour or so, so you've answered that. But my questions, sort of looking back forensically, are how did that happen? And more importantly, what specific actions can we take to get the process between the governor and the legislature back on track?
Bill, that is, again, like the survivor thing, is developing relationships, planning a strategy. And right now we're dealing with a governor who has kind of blinders on and really holding on to the things that she wants to get past, and not having a lot of flexibility. So I think there are conversations that we could take offline about who to talk with, and to present a plan that is much more reasonable and practical and really relevant to New Mexico, not trying to appease outside agencies who might have their eyes on New Mexico and with dollar signs in them. So it's a long-term goal, and it's not something that's going to happen right away, but I do think that it is doable. It's just talking to the right folks. And we have to identify who those are.
Thank you.
Great question. Other questions?
Jeannie Logston, I think you had a couple of questions. Would you like to unmute and ask those?
Hi, Jean, you're muted.
In sync with what the senator is saying about needing a PR campaign and needing a political strategy, because I think there's so much good information about what can be done and should be done and must be done, but it's packaged in a way that is pretty esoteric to people who don't follow water very much. And there's no political strategy behind it. So if I were in charge of a political strategy, the first thing I would do would be to find a couple of, at least one senator and one representative working together to develop a very simple bill about one priority, for example, the aquifer mapping project, and sell it in the interim sessions and sell it outside of the environmental committees, because I think the environmental committees are fairly, are generally very supportive of this kind of a simple bill. But it's the other senators and representatives that need to become educated about how important this is. And the simpler you make it, the easier it is to market the idea. And you have to work with individual voters in each district. Get them to contact their representative and their senator, and early on and continually, and not just one person but multiple people. Just make it a strategy, because if we don't get the aquifer mapping, I think we're just, our hands are tied. We don't have enough information to even speculate about how much water do we have and how long will it last. And without that, you're not going to get the pecan farmers to push for strong measures that will control usage by everybody, including themselves.
Mhm.
Well, we won't
So,
need to
I mean-
do that, if I may, Jean. Thank you for that, that offer, that observation. I think you're exactly right. Jean is with the League of Women Voters.
Mhm.
And,
No, and that's spot on, Gene, because it really is planting all of those seeds, and it's something that you've got to look at. I'm not a sports lesbian in any way, but I do make this reference of it's a long game that
Mhm.
you have to look at what your end goal is and how you're going to get to those. And as frustrating as it may be, and and unfortunately we're running out of time if we're not out of time already. But it is like what you're suggesting, and getting those folks, getting those champions, not only in the legislature, but also in your community, to get them to continue to talk to legislators, and we can work on strategies on how to do that. I know that you have to be nonpartisan, but like we were talking about in the beginning, we don't understand why water is a partisan issue when it shouldn't be.
Right.
Everybody's impacted by it. And so I think you're absolutely right that you need to do that. And that's the way to help move this along.
could I interject another thought, though? Um, the Water Security Planning Act passed unanimously in 2023.
Hmm.
It was an incredibly complicated bill. It was a state engineer's bill.
Hmm.
Senator Stefanix was the sponsor when she looked at the bill that the water ambassadors, task force members had drafted.
Mhm.
She said this will never pass unless it's a state engineer bill. The state engineer made it his bill, mostly because Senator Stefanix made all the arrangements with the governor's office. So incredibly important back support, if you will. I don't know how to describe it. But that passed the first session. And then it was like in 2024, there was,
You
the
mean
legislative.
2022 and 2023? Oh, wait, no,
Well,
2024, that's
It
right,
passed
yeah.
unanimously in
2023,
2023. In
yeah.
2024, the Legislative Finance Committee staff was still talking about the old statute and why planning didn't work. And so there was no money for regional water planning,
Mhm.
and nothing else got funded. And when I was ISC director, we had a collaborative solution to permanent Pecos River compact compliance. And the issue was between Carlsbad and Roswell. And if you don't know that polarizing issue, it's about as polarized as you can get. But they came to an agreement. And the legislature, in the very next session, our schedule was driven by the legislature. And we used that to force a collaborative agreement. And then we got a complicated bill passed the very next session. That's what water needs.
Mhm.
That's what water really needs. If we have to work on simple bills one at a time, we can. But surely we can find a way to do what we need to do instead of just chipping away at it. Because if we chip away at it, it's too late.
Well, and I would follow what Senator Stefanix did, and also what Jeannie was talking about was, presenting during the interim, making those connections, getting people interested in it, and then relying on your legislators to navigate and coordinate those conversations with people who can move it throughward. It is about human relationships and strategies, and it's figuring out what relationships you need to nurture and what strategies you need to use.
It's relationships,
Mhm.
relationships, relationships, relationships. Funny how New Mexico works on relationships.
Well, it's like 2 degrees of separation. I'm sure I'm related or connected to at least, well, I know Renee, I've known Renee for years. But I think, it's something that's lovely about New Mexico for the most part, that we all are connected in some way or another, at least by 2 or 3 degrees of separation.
That's true.
And so let's work that.
It's
Let's
my
use
home.
it.
That's one
Yeah.
of the things I love about this is that we have that here.
Mm-hmm.
Next question.
John Hawley has his hand up. John, will you unmute and ask your question?
John Hawley. I'll defer to Norm and Bill King and Bill Hannenberg. I've worked with them all. I was hired by the Soil Conservation Service to head up something called the Desert Project. We were headquartered at NMSU for 9 years, and I was supposed to be a participant in the decision makers conference that was held in December that Stacy Timmons ran off, but my 91-year-old buddy failed me, so I couldn't make it down there at the time. But I've been mapping aquifers for all my life, starting in Nevada and then moving down here from
John, do you have a question?
1971, and then moving over to Texas Tech to work on the high plains,
Hey,
Ogallala.
John,
And so
John,
I'm just an old man now, and I'd like to have Norm say something about what we do in our aquifer mapping programs.
I love John Hawley. He works for the New Mexico Bureau of Geology and Mineral Resources. He's worked for a lot of different agencies, but his brain was the key to unlocking the secrets of the Albuquerque aquifer.
Mm.
I have relied on the Bureau of Geology my entire career as a water policy engineer for the great information that they provide. And that brings me to a question that I wanted to ask. The state really does have some great experts. I was heading there. The legislature doesn't have any. The governor's office now has a water person, but that water person was providing disinformation during the legislative session. We have some great experts, and every year they get a chance to say what they need to do their jobs. And I was just thinking, what other successful enterprise never listens to its experts and doesn't ever give them what they need? One of the things that was new to me, I just learned it, is that there is a computer crisis in the state engineer office and the Interstate Stream Commission, and really across state government. They don't have the computer power they need to do their work. And my understanding at the ISC, it's basic servers, it's PCs, I mean, we're not even talking about the legacy software and hardware that hardly runs anymore. You know, it's just awful stuff.
Mm.
That wasn't even in the budget request this year to deal with their basic fundamental computer hardware issues.
So was it requested and not?
I have
you know,
no
that's-
idea.
That's the question. So, you know, as I was mentioning earlier, that I feel that the legislature is operating as a board of directors, and our job is to help those departments that are doing good work continue to do that good work, step in where they need resources, and then also step in if there are problems. You know, CYFD is an ongoing issue, and so, you know, you'll see that there's a lot of conversation around CYFD, but it's like, part of it is if we don't know, we can't do it, and we can't argue for it. And so it's really helpful, you know, like I had the courts represented a bill in the Senate that came over from the House that allowed the courts to not have to physically store documents. They had 10,000 bankers boxes worth full of divorce decrees, marriage licenses, DWI convictions, and they could either store them, they had to have a hard copy, or they could store them on microfiche. And I was like, that's what I used when I was in high school and in college. And so we didn't know that that was an issue until they brought it for us and asked us to you know, because apparently we have to make that decision, which I think is stupid that we're the ones that are making a decision that would help a department work better.
Exactly.
I don't understand why it's still, maybe someday I'll figure it out, but I think it's ridiculous. And the fact that, and I even said that, this bill is ridiculous and I don't understand why we're having to debate this. However, here's what they need. And so I think that's really important for those departments to feel comfortable of saying, we need this and we need you to champion it.
Yeah. Well, I heard this from somebody I believe is absolutely reliable, and I'm not going to tell you, I can't say who, but my understanding is the State Engineers Hydrology Bureau these are the state's best hydrologists, threatened to quit because they can't do their jobs because they don't have the computers that run the software they need to run.
The secretary needs to let us know. We need to, so because the thing is that if we get a listing of all the departments that just have outdated computer software, hardware, that could be something that all of us who have different interests can go ahead and say, this needs to be a budget item. And so there has to be those conversations, otherwise we can't advocate
Okay.
for it.
It needs to be a budget item.
Yes.
It has to be a budget
It
item.
does.
Next question. Well, I didn't finish with John. John got me off on the experts, you know, and why the state doesn't listen to its experts. I just want to honor John for the selfless way he has pursued his career to give us knowledge that we have acted on, even though most people don't know it, that have done a lot for New Mexico. So John, our gratitude to you and our recognition. John was also a preacher's kid, he told me, and we both don't know.
John's putting his thumbs down, though. It doesn't seem like that was a big deal.
We
That
both
was
don't know
favorable.
when to quit talking.
Okay.
All right.
And I know we're supposed to end at 8, right?
Yeah, so one more question?
I don't see anyone who has their hands up, so we do have time for one more question before our closing slides. If anyone has a question, please go ahead and unmute yourself, but please make it brief. Julie, I believe just put your hand up. Would you please unmute?
Yes, I'll ask it quickly. So here out of Albuquerque, and there's been some raised about this idea of the river being an economic resource and how we can kind of develop it. That makes me very nervous, and I'd like to just hear thoughts on engineered pathways for the Rio Grande.
Engineered pathways for the Rio Grande. Well, the Rio Grande is an engineered river, whether you know it or not. This question, I think, is more for me than for you. It's an artificial river. We've pushed, the river used to sweep across the floodplain from side to side, replenishing the bosque, renewing habitat, fresh cottonwood trees, patches here, there, the next flood wipes them out. And all of that, that balance came to an end, frankly, when we started running millions of sheep in New Mexico. That's history, but it really did lots of damage. But we also moved, Albuquerque was settled by people who wanted to live in the floodplain. And so if you want to live in the floodplain, what do you have to do? You have to control the river. And so the river has been pinned to the same place, and there's lots of issues with it. At the same time, Albuquerque has turned its back on the river as opposed to treating it as a resource. And it really is. It's, the river here is not much of a resource because it's a canal, but the river in Albuquerque still looks like a river. But we won't keep it unless we stop the groundwater pumping from accelerating, because the groundwater pumping is pumping the bottom out of the river. That's all there is to it. I think it's time for us to close.
We did have someone who very much wanted to ask one more question. I will make my closing slides very quick. So Renee, would you please ask your question?
Yeah, I'll make it quick. Norm, I was just wondering, you mentioned before the importance of the third sector, the civic sector, I think was a term you were talking about, and you were referring, I think at the time, to the lower Rio Grande. I was wondering, could you just amplify that a little bit? Is it your view that there's a lack of vitality on this topic from the civic sector? And related to that, I just want to thank you for all the work that you are doing with these dialogues. They are fantastic, and really commend you. And thank you, Carrie, also.
Well, thank you so much. So I wasn't referring to the lower Rio Grande. I think the civic sector is doing better off in the lower Rio Grande than it is in the middle Rio Grande, or maybe just about anywhere else in New Mexico. I was speaking of the civic sector or the third sector as a force, where nonprofits need to organize and form coalitions to pursue things like water. We don't all need to be the same organization. We need to be a network of organizations that is pursuing an existential priority. Did that help? I hope it did. Brittany, would you show the closing slides?
I will, and actually that is a fabulous transition because we are working with a coalition of other nonprofits at the Earth Day celebration on April 21st at Balloon Fiesta Park. It's going to be fabulous, and tickets are free in March. I just dropped into the chat the link to get those tickets. We really hope you'll join us at the booth. Again, that's April 21st from 10 a.m. to 4 p.m. I also want to wish everyone a happy World Water Day, which is tomorrow, the UN's World Water Day, and the theme is Water for Peace. So think about what you can do tomorrow to celebrate water and celebrate water for peace. We will not be having an April conversation workshop series. We're taking April off. We hope you will do something wonderful with your third Thursday that evening, but think of us and remember to come back in May. We'll have a fabulous presentation for you in May by Bruce Thompson, who is a UNM professor of environmental engineering, and we'll have a conversation with him about unconventional water resources. So look in your inbox for your May invitation. I will also put a link in the chat to the Zoom registration for that meeting, but please note that we've had to do a little bit of shuffling around. So when you go to register, the topic name may not quite be updated yet, but we will get that updated shortly.
Let me just put in a pitch for the May 16th workshop with Bruce Thompson. Bruce has a marvelous presentation on unconventional water. And that's what the governor's unstrategic bad water for a few at great expense is. It's unconventional water. Well, Bruce has experience with other kinds of unconventional water in New Mexico, researching the treatment, and he's got some things to tell us. So I hope everybody will tune in with that, and we will publicize it. Please continue, Brittany.
Senator Hamblen, thank you so much for taking the time to spend your evening with us. This has been a fabulous conversation. We're so grateful to you. Thank you also to our co-sponsors. We couldn't do it without you all. And if you enjoyed this presentation and you want to volunteer with us or you want to donate to help us keep producing these workshops, I will drop a link into the chat to our PayPal page. Again, we thank you all for spending the evening with us. We hope you have a great rest of your evening and a lot of food for thought tonight. I thought tonight's conversation was really fabulous. So don't forget to talk to your friends and family about water as often as you can, because the only way that we're going to move out of this crisis is with knowledge and general understanding of what's happening. And we don't get that unless you have those conversations with the people that you are close with. Thank you so much for a wonderful evening.
Bye, everybody.
Goodbye. Thank you for coming.
Norm, would you please stop the recording if you have not already?